In the shadow of Europe's grandest palaces, where golden halls echoed with whispered secrets and courtly intrigue, there lived a king whose very face became his curse. Picture this: a monarch so hideously transformed by disease that his own courtiers fled in terror. Servants refused to serve him, and eventually even mirrors were removed from his chambers. This is not the stuff of fairy tales or Gothic novels. This is the true story of Charles II of Austria, the last Habsburg king of Spain, whose final months were marked by such grotesque disfigurement that history itself seemed to recoil from recording the full horror. Have you ever wondered what happens when divine right meets human frailty in its most brutal form? When the very flesh that bore the crown begins to rot away while the king still draws breath? Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me tell you about a ruler whose face literally disappeared piece by piece until those who once bowed before him could no longer bear to look upon what remained. But before we descend into this medical nightmare that would make even the most hardened physicians of the time turn away in disgust, you need to understand something crucial about the world Charles inhabited. This wasn't just any king suffering from any ordinary illness. This was the culmination of 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, political machinations that spanned continents, and medical practices so primitive they bordered on torture. What happened to Charles wasn't merely a personal tragedy. It was the spectacular, horrifying collapse of an entire royal bloodline, played out in the most visceral way imaginable. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through the final year of Charles's life, when his mysterious ailment began its relentless assault on his features. We'll uncover the desperate attempts by court physicians to hide the truth, the political chaos that erupted as European powers circled like vultures around a dying empire, and the eerie folklore that still whispers about the faceless king in the corridors of the Alcazar of Madrid. Most disturbing of all, we'll explore the mounting evidence that suggests Charles's condition might not have been entirely natural. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some historians argue that Charles II represents not just the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, but perhaps the most horrifying royal death in recorded European history. And you'll discover why, for nearly 3 centuries, the full details of his final months were deliberately obscured, buried in archives that few dared to examine. Let me paint you a picture of Madrid in the autumn of 1699. The air hung thick with incense and the acrid smell of medicinal herbs burning in braziers throughout the royal palace. Charles, then 38 years old, had already earned the nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, due to his strange behavior and the persistent rumors that dark magic surrounded his reign. But what was about to unfold would make those earlier whispers seem quaint by comparison. The first signs appeared subtly, as these things often do. A small lesion on Charles's left cheek, no larger than a copper coin, that his physicians initially dismissed as a minor infection. In the Habsburg court, where every royal blemish was scrutinized for political significance, this seemed almost refreshingly ordinary. The king had always been sickly after all, born with a severe underbite that made eating difficult, prone to seizures that left him unconscious for hours, and cursed with a constitution so weak that he'd nearly died a dozen times before reaching adulthood. One more health problem hardly seemed worth noting. But this wasn't just another ailment. Within weeks, the small sore had begun to spread, eating away at the surrounding flesh with a voracious appetite that horrified even the most experienced court physicians. The smell began next, a sweet, sickly odor that no amount of perfume could mask, permeating the king's chambers and eventually forcing the relocation of court functions to the opposite wing of the palace. Dr. Juan de Cabriada, the king's personal physician and one of the most respected medical minds in Europe, found himself confronting something he'd never encountered in 40 years of practice. The infection, if that's what it was, seemed to follow no known pattern. It didn't respond to the traditional treatments, bloodletting, purging, the application of heated metals to burn away diseased tissue. If anything, these interventions seemed to accelerate the decay. What made the situation even more nightmarish was the king's apparent inability to feel pain in the affected areas. Charles would touch the rotting portions of his face with a detached curiosity that unnerved everyone around him. He seemed almost fascinated by his own dissolution, spending hours studying his reflection in hand mirrors before the court officials finally convinced him to put them away. The political implications became clear almost immediately. Charles had no heir. His 2 marriages had produced no children. And at 38, with his health rapidly deteriorating, the likelihood of succession seemed increasingly remote. The great powers of Europe, who had been watching the Spanish Habsburg line with the patience of undertakers, suddenly found themselves confronting an accelerated timeline. The War of Spanish Succession, which many had assumed lay years in the future, now seemed imminent. French ambassadors began appearing at court with increasing frequency, their visits ostensibly social but clearly intelligence-gathering missions. Austrian archdukes sent physicians of their own, men whose medical expertise seemed suspiciously combined with political awareness. Even the English, traditional enemies of Spanish power, dispatched envoys bearing gifts of rare medicines and offers of consultation with London's finest doctors. But perhaps most telling was the response of Charles's own court. The great nobles of Spain, men whose families had served the Habsburgs for generations, began to distance themselves from their dying king. Attendance at royal audiences dropped precipitously. The elaborate court ceremonies that had defined Spanish royal life for centuries were quietly scaled back, then abandoned altogether. It was as if the entire Spanish establishment was preparing for a post-Charles world while the king still lived. In the king's private chambers, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Queen Maria Anna of Neuburg, Charles's second wife, had initially shown remarkable devotion to her husband, despite his increasingly disturbing appearance. But as the disease progressed and Charles's face became unrecognizable, even she began to limit her visits. Palace servants reported that she would only meet with the king while he wore a silk mask, specially crafted by the court seamstresses to cover the worst of the damage. The mask itself became a source of fascination and horror throughout the court. Made of the finest Chinese silk and decorated with gold thread, it should have been a thing of beauty. Instead, it became a ghoulish necessity, hiding features that had become too terrible for human eyes to bear. The seamstresses who created these masks, for several were needed as the disease progressed, were sworn to secrecy about what they had seen. 2 of them, according to palace records, requested transfers to other duties within weeks of beginning their work. Dr. Cabriada's private notes from this period, discovered centuries later in the archives of the Royal Library, reveal the full extent of his bewilderment and growing desperation. "The flesh dissolves as if consumed by invisible fire," he wrote in November 1699. "No treatment avails. The king bears this horror with a resignation that troubles me more than his suffering. It is as if he expected this fate, as if he welcomed it." The doctor's suspicions about supernatural involvement weren't entirely unreasonable given the context of the time. The Spanish court had long been obsessed with witchcraft and divine punishment. Charles himself had been subjected to numerous exorcisms throughout his life, and the persistent rumors about his family's cursed bloodline made supernatural explanations seem plausible to many observers. But Cabriada was also a man of science, trained in the new medical techniques emerging from France and Italy. His attempts to document and understand Charles's condition represent some of the earliest systematic medical observations in Spanish history. Unfortunately, they also chronicle a descent into horror that would challenge everything the doctor thought he knew about disease, death, and the limits of human endurance. As winter approached and Charles's condition continued to deteriorate, the court began to take on the atmosphere of a death watch. The king's public appearances ceased entirely. Official portraits from this period show him either in profile or wearing elaborate headpieces that obscure his features entirely. Foreign ambassadors reported that audiences with the king were conducted through screens or curtains, his voice emerging from behind barriers like that of an oracle, delivering prophecies from another world. The implications for Spain's vast empire were staggering. From the Philippines to Peru, from Naples to the Netherlands, Spanish territories awaited news of their king's health with growing anxiety. Trade began to suffer as merchants hesitated to make long-term commitments to a realm whose future seemed increasingly uncertain. The Spanish navy, already weakened by decades of warfare, found itself struggling to maintain order in distant colonies, where local officials began to act with increasing independence. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this unfolding tragedy was the silence that surrounded it. The Spanish court, renowned throughout Europe for its elaborate ceremonial protocols and detailed record-keeping, suddenly became remarkably secretive about the king's condition. Official bulletins spoke vaguely of indisposition and temporary withdrawal from public duties. Foreign observers were given carefully scripted accounts that bore little resemblance to the reality unfolding behind palace walls. This conspiracy of silence would have profound consequences for how history remembered Charles II. For centuries, the full extent of his final illness remained hidden, known only to a handful of court insiders whose discretion was ensured through a combination of loyalty, fear, and generous financial incentives. The true story of the faceless king became a ghost story, whispered in the corridors of European palaces, but never officially acknowledged. As we prepare to delve deeper into this medical mystery and political cover-up, remember that you're about to witness the final act of one of history's most powerful dynasties. The Habsburgs, who had ruled vast portions of Europe for centuries, were about to face their most humiliating defeat, not on any battlefield, but in the rotting flesh of their last Spanish king. What happened next would test the limits of royal protocol and human endurance in ways that no one at court could have anticipated. By December of 1699, Charles's condition had progressed beyond anything recorded in medical literature of the time. The disease had consumed not just the surface of his skin, but had begun eating into the underlying bone structure of his face. Palace records, written in the coded language that court officials used to discuss sensitive matters, describe structural compromises and architectural failures. Euphemisms that barely concealed the horrifying reality. The king's jaw, already malformed from generations of Habsburg inbreeding, began to collapse entirely on the left side. His ability to speak became severely compromised, forcing him to communicate through written notes or whispered words that only his closest attendants could decipher. Eating became an ordeal that required specially prepared liquid meals administered through a silver tube that bypassed the damaged portions of his mouth. The very act of sustaining life had become a grotesque medical procedure performed multiple times daily behind locked doors. Dr. Cabriada's desperation led him to consult with physicians throughout Europe, sending detailed drawings and descriptions to medical schools in Padua, Paris, and Vienna. The responses he received were uniformly disturbing. Several colleagues suggested that Charles was suffering from a form of royal plague, a mysterious condition that supposedly affected only those of the highest noble blood. Others proposed more sinister explanations, hinting at poisoning by political enemies or divine punishment for sins unknown. One particularly chilling response came from Dr. Andreas Wessling at the University of Padua, who had studied similar cases in the Italian nobility. His letter, preserved in the papal archives, suggested that Charles might be experiencing a form of sympathetic decay, a condition where the physical body began to mirror the spiritual corruption of the bloodline. Whether Wessling intended this as medical diagnosis or theological commentary remains unclear, but his words haunted Cabriada for the remainder of his service to the crown. The Queen's reaction to her husband's deteriorating condition revealed the profound psychological toll this ordeal was taking on everyone at court. Maria Anna of Neuburg, once known for her charitable works and devotion to the poor, became increasingly reclusive and paranoid. She began consulting with fortune-tellers and mystics, seeking explanations for her husband's affliction that science seemed unable to provide. Palace servants reported finding her in the chapel at all hours, praying with an intensity that bordered on mania. Her letters to her family in Germany, intercepted by court censors and preserved in the Spanish state archives, paint a picture of a woman slowly losing her grip on reality. "The thing that was my husband grows more terrible each day," she wrote to her sister in February 1700. "I fear I am witnessing not illness, but transformation into something that should not exist in God's creation. The priests speak of trials and tribulations, but what sin could warrant such punishment? What crime against heaven could justify such horror?" The religious implications of Charles's condition created a crisis of faith that rippled throughout the Spanish court and beyond. The Catholic Church, which had always maintained that kings ruled by divine right, found itself confronting a theological puzzle. If Charles was God's chosen representative on earth, what did his hideous transformation say about divine judgment? The Inquisition, still a powerful force in Spanish society, began investigating potential supernatural causes for the king's affliction, interviewing suspected witches and heretics with renewed fervor. Cardinal Luis Manuel Fernández de Portocarrero, the most influential religious figure in Spain, found himself walking a dangerous theological tightrope. He needed to maintain the legitimacy of royal authority while acknowledging the obvious signs of divine displeasure. His solution was both ingenious and disturbing. He began promoting the idea that Charles's suffering was a form of holy martyrdom, a purification process that would ultimately redeem not just the king, but the entire Spanish Empire. This interpretation gained traction among certain segments of the court and clergy, but it required increasingly elaborate explanations as Charles's condition worsened. By spring of 1700, the king's face had deteriorated to such an extent that even the silk masks could no longer effectively conceal the damage. The seamstresses tasked with creating new coverings reported that their work had become less about hiding disfigurement and more about containing what they described as active decay. The smell had become so overwhelming that special ventilation systems were installed in the king's quarters, with servants burning aromatic woods and incense around the clock. Even these measures proved insufficient. Foreign ambassadors began reporting that the entire royal palace had taken on a sickly, sweet odor that could be detected from the courtyard. Some claimed they could identify which rooms the king had recently occupied simply by following the scent. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Charles's own response to his transformation. Rather than the despair or rage one might expect, the king seemed to enter a state of eerie acceptance that troubled everyone around him. He began referring to himself in the past tense, speaking of the king who was, as if he had already died and was merely observing his own corpse. His attendants reported conversations where Charles would discuss his funeral arrangements with the detached interest of someone planning a dinner party. Dr. Cabriada's notes from this period reveal his growing conviction that Charles's mental state was perhaps more disturbing than his physical condition. "His Majesty speaks of death as a friend approaching," the physician wrote. "He shows no fear, no sadness, only a terrible patience. It is as if he awaits something beyond mere death, some final revelation or transformation that will complete this horrible process." The political consequences of Charles's deterioration accelerated throughout the spring and summer of 1700. The major European powers, no longer content to wait for natural succession, began positioning themselves for the inevitable conflict over Spanish territories. Louis XIV of France, despite being Charles's nephew, made increasingly bold claims about French rights to Spanish inheritance. The Austrian Habsburgs dispatched a series of physicians who were clearly intelligence agents in disguise, seeking detailed information about Charles's condition and the likelihood of recovery. The English, ever opportunistic, began negotiating secret agreements with both French and Austrian representatives, positioning themselves to profit from Spanish weakness regardless of who ultimately claimed the throne. Dutch merchants, meanwhile, quietly began redirecting their trade routes to avoid Spanish territories, anticipating the commercial disruption that would inevitably follow Charles's death. Within Spain itself, the great noble families began hedging their bets with increasing boldness. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, descendant of the admiral who had commanded the Spanish Armada, began corresponding with French agents about potential accommodation with a Bourbon successor. The Count of Monterrey opened similar discussions with Austrian representatives. The Spanish court, once a model of unified loyalty to the crown, had become a marketplace where allegiances were quietly bought and sold in preparation for the coming transition. The common people of Spain, largely unaware of the full extent of their king's condition, began experiencing the effects through more subtle channels. Trade disruptions led to shortages of imported goods. The uncertainty surrounding succession caused wealthy merchants to hoard currency, leading to inflation in basic necessities. Perhaps most ominously, the king's absence from public ceremonies and religious observances created a growing sense that the natural order itself was breaking down. Folk tales began circulating throughout Spanish territories about a cursed king whose face had been stolen by demons. These stories, spread by traveling merchants and pilgrims, took on increasingly elaborate forms as they moved from village to village. Some claimed that Charles had made a pact with Satan to preserve Spanish power, only to have the devil claim his face as payment. Others suggested that the king had been replaced by an impostor, and that the real Charles was imprisoned in a dungeon beneath the palace while a demon wore his crown. The Inquisition's investigation into these rumors led to arrests throughout the kingdom, but seemed only to fuel more speculation. The more authorities tried to suppress talk of supernatural explanations for the king's condition, the more convinced people became that dark forces were at work. Some regions experienced outbreaks of religious mania, with peasants claiming to have visions of the faceless king wandering the countryside in search of redemption. By autumn of 1700, Charles's condition had progressed to a point that defied all medical understanding of the time. The disease had consumed virtually all recognizable facial features, leaving behind what Dr. Cabriada could only describe as a void where once resided the image of divine authority. The king's eyes, once described by court poets as reflecting the wisdom of his ancestors, had become hollow sockets that seemed to gaze into eternity itself. Yet somehow, impossibly, Charles continued to live. His body, despite the horrific damage to his face, maintained basic functions with a persistence that mystified his physicians. He could still hear, though his responses suggested he was listening to voices that others could not detect. He could still speak, though his words emerged as whispers from the ruins of his mouth, often carrying messages that seemed to come from beyond the grave. The final weeks of Charles's life would test everyone around him in ways that no royal protocol had ever anticipated. The question was no longer when the king would die, but whether what remained could still be considered human. The courtiers who had once competed for the privilege of serving their monarch now drew lots to determine who would be forced to attend him. The bravest among them reported that being in Charles's presence felt like standing at the threshold between the world of the living and something far more terrible. As we approach the climactic end of this royal nightmare, you'll discover how the death of a faceless king would ultimately reshape the balance of power in Europe and launch a war that would consume the continent for over a decade. But first, you need to understand the final horror that awaited those who witnessed Charles II's last moments on Earth. A death so disturbing that it was immediately classified by the Spanish court and hidden from public knowledge for nearly 3 centuries. The autumn of 1700 brought with it an atmosphere of dread that seemed to seep through the very stones of the Alcazar. Palace servants began reporting strange phenomena in the corridors surrounding the king's chambers. Candles would extinguish themselves without explanation. The sound of weeping could be heard echoing from empty rooms. Most disturbing of all, Several attendants claim to have encountered a figure in royal robes wandering the halls at night, its face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to contain nothing but shadow. These reports might have been dismissed as hysteria, born from months of stress and horror, but they came from too many reliable sources to ignore. Captain Diego de Vargas, head of the Royal Guard and a man known for his practical nature, filed an official report describing his encounter with what he believed to be the king in the early hours of October 15th. According to his account, he had challenged a robed figure moving through the portrait gallery, only to have it turn towards him with what he described as an absence where a face should be. The figure had spoken his name in the king's voice before vanishing into the shadows. Dr. Cabriada's medical journals from this period reveal a physician pushed beyond the limits of his understanding and sanity. His handwriting, once precise and scholarly, had become erratic and difficult to read. His diagnoses grew increasingly desperate and unconventional. He began prescribing treatments that bordered on the occult: powdered unicorn horn mixed with holy water, silver plates placed over the affected areas during the full moon, even attempts to transfer the disease to condemned criminals through ritualistic blood exchanges. The international medical community, initially eager to study Charles's unique condition, began withdrawing their correspondence as reports of Dr. Cabriada's experimental treatments reached them. A letter from the Royal College of Physicians in London, dated November 1700, politely but firmly declined further consultation, citing theological concerns about the nature of the affliction. Similar responses came from medical schools across Europe, effectively isolating the Spanish court from any external medical expertise. The isolation was compounded by the growing reluctance of foreign diplomats to visit the palace. The French ambassador, the Marquis d'Harcourt, had initially maintained regular audiences with Charles despite his condition, but by October 1700, even he began conducting diplomatic business through intermediaries. His private correspondence with Versailles, intercepted by Spanish intelligence, described the king's presence as an assault upon the very concept of human dignity, and warned that prolonged exposure to Charles's condition was damaging the mental health of embassy staff. The Queen's own deterioration had become almost as concerning as her husband's physical decay. Maria Anna had begun experiencing what her personal physician described as sympathetic symptoms, phantom pains in her own face that seemed to mirror her husband's destroyed features. She would spend hours touching her cheeks and jaw, as if confirming they remained intact. Her ladies-in-waiting reported finding her standing before mirrors in the middle of the night, studying her reflection with the same morbid fascination that Charles had once shown. Palace records from this period, written in increasingly coded language, describe the establishment of what can only be called a parallel court. While Charles remained technically king, actual governance had been quietly transferred to a council of regents, who met in chambers as far from the royal quarters as possible. Queen Maria Anna nominally headed this council, but her erratic behaviour meant that real power rested with Cardinal Portocarrero and a handful of trusted nobles who had proven capable of functioning despite the horrific circumstances. The cardinal himself had become an almost mystical figure within the palace, spending hours in prayer and consultation with theologians about the spiritual implications of Charles's condition. He had developed an elaborate theory that the king's suffering represented a form of divine testing, similar to the trials faced by Job in the Old Testament. According to this interpretation, Charles's hideous transformation was actually a sign of God's special favour, a purification process that would ultimately grant him sainthood. This theological framework provided some comfort to those struggling to understand the inexplicable horror they witnessed daily, but it also created new anxieties about how to treat a king who might be undergoing divine transformation. Should his commands still be obeyed if they came from what was increasingly resembling a living corpse? Could sacraments be administered to someone whose very appearance seemed to challenge the concept of human creation in God's image? The Inquisition's investigation into potential supernatural causes had expanded beyond the palace walls. creating a climate of suspicion and fear throughout Madrid. Suspected witches were arrested in increasing numbers, with many subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques designed to extract confessions about curses placed upon the royal family. The tribunal's records, preserved in the archives of the Spanish National Library, detail dozens of cases where alleged practitioners of dark magic were forced to explain their possible connection to the king's condition. Most of these investigations led nowhere, but they served a useful political purpose by providing explanations that allowed the Spanish establishment to avoid confronting more disturbing possibilities. If Charles's condition could be blamed on witchcraft or enemy poisoning, it preserved the legitimacy of royal authority while explaining away the obvious signs of Habsburg genetic decay. The alternative, acknowledging that centuries of inbreeding had produced a bloodline so corrupted that it was literally rotting away, was too dangerous for the Spanish monarchy to contemplate. The economic consequences of the royal crisis were becoming impossible to hide. Spanish colonial administrators in the Americas began reporting increased resistance from local populations who had heard rumors about their king's condition. The flow of silver from Potosi, which had sustained Spanish power for over a century, slowed to a trickle as miners and merchants questioned whether contracts signed with a decomposing monarch would be honored by his successors. European financial markets began treating Spanish debt as increasingly risky, driving up borrowing costs at precisely the moment when the crown needed funds to maintain military readiness. The Dutch, who had long served as bankers to the Spanish Empire, quietly began liquidating their Spanish holdings and redirecting investment toward France and Austria. Even the traditionally loyal Portuguese began hedging their bets, opening diplomatic channels with potential Habsburg successors. Within the palace itself, the practical challenges of caring for Charles had become almost insurmountable. The king's dietary needs had evolved beyond anything the royal kitchens could accommodate. His ability to consume solid food had disappeared entirely, forcing attendants to administer nutrition through increasingly complex mechanical devices. Silver tubes and ivory funnels became essential tools for keeping the king alive, transforming the royal chambers into something resembling a medical laboratory more than a seat of power. The odor problem had reached crisis proportions, despite the installation of elaborate ventilation systems. Palace engineers had constructed a network of ducts and fans designed to continuously circulate fresh air through the king's quarters, but the smell seemed to permeate everything it touched. Tapestries and furniture had to be replaced weekly. Even the stone walls showed signs of staining from whatever gases the king's condition was producing. Dr. Cabriada's desperation led him to increasingly extreme measures. His journals describe experiments with mercury treatments, the application of heated metals to burn away diseased tissue, and even attempts at surgical reconstruction using techniques borrowed from military field medicine. None of these interventions showed any success, and many seemed to accelerate the decay. By November 1700, the physician was essentially conducting experimental surgery on a living monarch with no oversight beyond his own increasingly questionable judgment. The psychological toll on palace staff had become severe enough to affect basic operations. Servants were requesting transfers at unprecedented rates, often citing religious objections to their duties, rather than acknowledging their horror at the king's appearance. The Royal Guard reported increasing incidents of fainting and hysteria among new recruits assigned to protect Charles's chambers. Even veteran courtiers who had served the Habsburg family for decades found themselves unable to maintain their composure in the king's presence. Foreign intelligence reports from this period paint a picture of a court in complete psychological collapse. Venetian spies described palace personnel exhibiting symptoms similar to what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress. French agents reported that entire sections of the Alcazar had been abandoned as too disturbing for normal human habitation. English observers noted that Spanish diplomatic communications had become increasingly erratic and difficult to interpret, suggesting that the trauma was affecting the monarchy's ability to conduct international relations. The question of succession, already complicated by Charles's lack of an heir, had become even more complex due to doubts about his mental competency. European legal scholars debated whether a king whose condition had progressed so far beyond normal human experience could still be considered capable of making binding political decisions. The will that Charles had signed earlier in his reign was being challenged on grounds that it might have been executed by someone who was no longer legally human. These debates, conducted in hushed tones in universities and diplomatic circles across Europe, represented an unprecedented challenge to the concept of divine right monarchy. If a king appointed by God could be transformed into something that defied natural law, what did that say about the legitimacy of royal authority itself? The implications were so disturbing that most political theorists preferred to avoid the question entirely, focusing instead on practical issues of succession and territorial division. As winter approached and Charles's condition showed no signs of improvement, the Spanish court began preparing for what everyone understood would be the final act of this royal nightmare. The king's lucid moments had become increasingly rare and were often marked by proclamations that seemed to come from someone who had already crossed into death. He spoke frequently of seeing his ancestors, describing conversations with long-dead Habsburg monarchs who appeared to be welcoming him into their eternal court. These deathbed visions, if that's what they were, provided the only moments of peace that Charles seemed to experience. During these episodes, witnesses reported that the king's voice would become clearer and stronger, as if death was restoring some measure of his former dignity. He would speak of Spanish glory and Habsburg destiny with an eloquence that reminded listeners of the royal majesty he had once embodied, before his words would fade back into the whispered moans that had become his normal mode of communication. The final horror was yet to come, and it would test everyone's understanding of what it meant to witness the death of a king. As November drew to a close, Charles's condition entered a phase that Dr. Cabriada could only describe as active dissolution, a process so disturbing that it would be immediately classified by Spanish authorities and hidden from public knowledge for centuries. What happened in those final days would challenge everything the European world thought it knew about death, kingship, and the limits of human suffering. The stage was set for a royal death unlike any in recorded history, one that would haunt the survivors and reshape the political landscape of Europe in ways that no one could have anticipated. As Charles II approached his final moments, the question was no longer simply when he would die, but whether what remained of him could still be considered a king at all.